Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel here today. Let me start with saying I'm really, really sorry I cannot be there with you in person today. I was very much looking forward to, not least because this is a really important discussion on the issue of forgotten crisis. As my focus is on migration, I would like to, of course, discuss the notion of forgotten crisis in relation to migration, and then raise a couple of points for reflection and discussion. Maybe to start with a main observation, when it comes to migration, like with anything else, whether it gets a lot of attention or might be forgotten really depends on where it's happening, or in the case of migration, where it's going to. When it's about migration towards Europe, migration is far from a forgotten crisis. You could even argue it's the opposite of forgotten. It's over publicized. It's very vivid. It's overrepresented, and it's already called a crisis, especially by media and politicians. Before you could even reasonably argue it is a crisis. But the further you get away from Europe, that is often where the real crisis takes place. The crisis of migration is not when refugees and migrants arrive in Europe, usually in totally manageable numbers. The crisis is further away, also for those who may be heading towards Europe. Think about the Afghans who were killed at the border with Iran. Think about the thousands of migrants ending up in detention centers, for example, in Libya. Think about the deaths during the Sahara crossings in the Sahel. In 2016, for the first time, we published numbers and estimates concluding that a lot more people die during these kind of overland crossings as compared to the Mediterranean crossings. Of course, not to say that these kind of tragedies don't take place in the Mediterranean, as we sadly saw again this week off the coast of Greece. But there's a lot of focus on these deaths in the Mediterranean. So in all of this, there's an out of sight, out of mind dynamic at play, or maybe I should say tactic at play. So the further you push these migration movements away from your borders, which tends to be the direction of a lot of the migration policy making these days, the more likely you make it a crisis, but also the more likely you make it a forgotten crisis. And even more forgotten are the migration dynamics that are not heading towards Europe at all, or towards the United States. So think about Mayotte, where the sea route from the Comoros is one of the most deadly migration routes globally. Or think about what we call the southern route from the Horn of Africa towards South Africa, where migrants may also die while in transit, and where they are met with a lot of violence and xenophobia upon arrival in South Africa. Now, another aspect I would really like to zoom in on here in the context of forgotten crisis is the situation of migrants and refugees in countries in conflict. They are really among one of the most forgotten groups. So right now, think of the millions of refugees and migrants who were already in Sudan before the current fighting started, like the many Eritreans, for example, or the Eritrean refugees in camps in Tigray in Ethiopia when the war started there, or migrants and refugees in Libya. But a key example I would really like to draw the attention to here is Yemen. For more than a decade, an average of 8,000 migrants every month, mainly from Ethiopia, have been crossing from the Horn of Africa to Yemen, mainly to reach Saudi Arabia. 8,000 migrants a month, hundreds and hundreds of thousands in total. And their situation seems to be getting worse and worse. They experience an endless cycle of violence, abuse, exploitation, trafficking, slavery, and killings all along this route at every step of the way, on a scale that is probably only comparable to Libya, with one striking difference in the case of the Saudi Arabian Yemen border, where migrants are deliberately killed directly by Saudi Arabian state officials. Yet they are even more forgotten than migrants in Libya, you could argue, presumably because it's far away from Europe, and the final destination of these migrants is Saudi Arabia, and it's not Europe. So this case of migrants in Yemen is really a forgotten crisis within a forgotten crisis, as Yemen itself is already a forgotten humanitarian crisis. Before I stop, I would like to reflect also a little bit on the word crisis in relation to migration. What I just described, the situation of migrants in Yemen or Libya, yes, that's a crisis for the migrants themselves. But this word crisis is also used too easily in relation to migration, and we have to be careful here. It creates a sense that things are out of control. And linked to this is the use of big numbers. We've seen a lot of statements and advocacy around reaching more than 100 million displaced people last year. We saw it again earlier this week, well over 100 million displaced people, without good explainers that the majority of those are IDPs, internally displaced people, and that less than a third are refugees who cross the border. But then we see a minister a couple of months ago in the United Kingdom using this figure and saying there might be 100 million refugees coming to the UK. So that's how this kind of advocacy potentially backfires. Or take climate change and migration. When it's about people who might be displaced due to climate change or environmental factors, it's always the highest side of a massive margin of the estimates that will end up in the media headlines, and often accompanied by an automatic assumption that all those people will primarily move from south to north. So all of this creates a fear of migration and a sense of helplessness. It feeds into a crisis narrative where that's unhelpful, where it might backfire, and where it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the result is even more forgotten crisis, where there's a real migration crisis happening. Now, my focus is migration, as I said. So, of course, here I'm talking about how migrants and refugees tend to be forgotten. But there's also clearly a mobility bias. We focus a lot on people who are moving, especially those moving cross-border. But we also know that in almost every conflict and crisis situation, the most vulnerable people are those who are unable to move. And this is true in conflict situations, but also in the case of movement due to climate change effects. So that's not about migration, but it gets us back to forgotten humanitarian crisis more generally. That's probably a good moment for me to stop and hand it back to anyone else with a broader perspective. But just before I stop, some last reflections on the guiding questions on what can be done about this issue of forgotten migration crisis. On migrants in countries in crisis, there's actually a very good initiative, but it's a bit of a forgotten initiative, which is called the Migrants in Countries in Crisis Initiative, or MICIC, which provide guidelines, examples of good practices, how to respond. So that's something that should be activated whenever there's a crisis in which migrants get caught. We, also as humanitarians, have to be careful in our own advocacy to not feed into a crisis narrative where it's not needed or where it might actually backfire. And also important to keep raising awareness on the actual forgotten crisis. Our colleagues from the Norwegian Refugee Council, they have this annual overview of neglected crisis, which I think is a very good initiative to maintain attention on some of these most forgotten crises. Finally, to a large extent, these crises are not so much forgotten by decision makers. Yes, they maybe are by the general public, but decision makers are generally very well aware of all the various crises that are happening around the world. The problem is how to mobilize the right attention and funding to adequately respond. And that is also very much a political issue, an issue of political will. That defines what becomes a crisis and what doesn't, and what becomes a forgotten or neglected crisis and what doesn't. So to end with something the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, Johansson, said a few months ago in an interview, the refugee flows from Ukraine are maybe not even a crisis, I'm quoting here. So a few 100,000 refugees and migrants from further away are quickly called a migration crisis, but millions and millions of refugees from Ukraine, and it's not a crisis. And I think the difference here is the political will to respond in a certain way. I'll leave it at that. Again, I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you in person, also to be able to further reflect on some of these points and some of the points made by the other panelists. Hopefully I'm going to be able to be there next year. Thank you very much for your attention. and I wish you a great continuation of the discussion.